God creates dinosaurs. God destroys dinosaurs. God creates man. Man destroys God. Man creates dinosaurs.
Rex. Yes, this is a video about Dino Rex. Can we roll the tape?
Among fighting game fans, there is a subset of players that will dive into broken fighting games and find ways to enjoy them despite their issues, and maybe even sometimes because of their issues. They call themselves kusoge players, kusoge being a borrowed phrase from Japanese that translates to approximately shitty game. But even among these brave souls that can find ways to love games that other players have written off as unlovable, Dino Rex has a reputation, and it isn't a good one. Even people that will seek out offbeat fighting games have a hard time finding things to like about Dino Rex. But rather than explaining why you shouldn't play Dino Rex, some of them will just tell you to not play it and leave it there. However, in a twist that no one could have predicted, the mystery around Dino Rex fueled interest in a tournament that managed to raise a prize pool of over 2,000 Dino Bucks and filled a capped 128 player bracket. That tournament is likely why you know what Dino Rex even is, and it might be why you were interested enough to click on this video. And not to brag, but I placed in top 32 of that event, which makes me, scientifically speaking, the most powerful virtual YouTuber in existence. However, underneath all the memes and irony surrounding Dino Rex is a fascinating story about the development of a very unique game. So let's do some archaeology here and dig into what is secretly, not so secretly, a very special game. Alright, can we get some like time machine effects or something like that? Do we have the budget for that? Oh yeah. In order to understand the story of Dino Rex, we have to go back to 1988, several years before Dino Rex would even begin development. Prior to working on video games, Takatsuna Senba worked in the animation industry, and he served as the animation director for the mecha scenes in a little film you might have seen called Mobile Suit Gundam Char's Counterattack. After finishing his work on the film, Senba departed from the animation industry to take a job at Taito. In a 2001 interview with the gaming magazine Continue, he explains how his departure was actually the result of overwork causing his elbow to separate from the rest of his arm, and that he also thought that working at Taito would be easier. During his tenure at Taito, Senba worked on a range of different titles, and ultimately worked as the planner and designer for two different games, Gun Frontier and Metal Black, also known as Gun Frontier 2. As a fun aside, the beam mechanics in Metal Black were actually heavily influenced by the way that beam weapons work in the Gundam universe, but this isn't a video about shooting games, at least mostly. The game that would ultimately become Dino Rex actually began life as a helicopter-based shooting game. However, something happened during the course of its development. In 1991, Street Fighter II landed in arcades and was an immediate smash hit. In terms of sales volume, the financial success of Street Fighter II would remain unrivaled until the release of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate over 20 years later. If you need a visual aid to get an idea of what this would look like, this is what it looks like when the alkaline metal cesium makes contact with water. Got it? Cool, but I'm gonna play it again because it's kinda sick. Looking back from the year of our Lord and Savior, Luigi Mario 2022, it can be hard to grasp just how impactful Street Fighter II was on its release. So let's do a quick visualization. Close your eyes and imagine that you're sitting down to play a fighting game, and you've got an arcade stick in your lap. How many buttons does that stick have? Does it have 6, maybe 8? If that's the case, you can largely thank Street Fighter II for that. And what happens if you do a quarter circle forward motion and you press punch? Did you imagine something like a fireball special move? If that's the case, again, that's Street Fighter II. But what about something a little bit more simple? What if you tap up on the joystick? Did you imagine your character jumping? If so, once again, that's Street Fighter 2. Many of the genre conventions that we take for granted today didn't exist prior to the tremendous success of Street Fighter 2. And in essence, neither did the fighting game genre. Yes, there were fighting games beforehand, but there's not a lot of connected tissue between them that would make you think that there was something of a genre pulling them all together. It feels a little bit like looking at experimental films that were created at the start of movie making, before we had established conventions for story structure and filmography. Let's take Street Fighter 1, for example. There were 2 versions of this cabinet produced, one of which only has 2 buttons that are pressure sensitive, and hitting them harder will actually make the character do stronger attacks. But let's just look at the screen for now. You can see that the life bars are right there in the center of the screen, which is not something that you would see in a modern fighting game. You would expect to see maybe the health bars in the top left and top right parts of the screen, and maybe a super meter or some kind of meter mechanic reflected in the bottom left and the bottom right. Those are all conventions that were established by Street Fighter 2 and its contemporaries and imitators, and they're not necessarily something that you would see in those earlier fighting games like Street Fighter 1 or Karate Champ. Bringing things back to Dino Rex, as a consequence of Street Fighter 2's release, higher-ups at Taito decided that the existing helicopter-based shooting project now needed to be a fighting game, and Dino Rex as we know it was born. However, there are some fun caveats here. For example, at the time, Taito's directors thought that shooting games were simple projects, and so they were typically given to new hires. Because Dino Rex had started off life as a shooter, the team behind it was mostly new hires and novices that were being led by a director who up until relatively recently had been working as an animation director on the Mobile Suit Gundam franchise. And together, they were going to try to make a fighting game. It's not totally unlike the story of the Iguanodon. Paleontology, but especially early paleontology, has an odd track record. Someone would find a bunch of bones and fit them together in a way that seemed to make sense, and then make a story up about it. They would then present that to their peers, who would maybe nod their heads and say,
"Yeah, that makes sense."
Iguanodon was one of the first dinosaurs discovered, and if you go search for it now, you're going to find images of different dinosaurs, some of which look nothing alike. And it's not that anyone was doing poor work, but they were only working with the information that they had available at the time. And that's not totally unlike the story of Dino Rex. You have a team trying to piece together a fighting game without the knowledge of what a fighting game is going to look like in the future. The end result is a post-Street Fighter 2 game that feels very much more like one of the pre-Street Fighter 2 games. In some ways, Dino Rex is ahead of the curve on things, and in other ways, very far behind. Senba has cited Street Fighter 1 as an influence on the game's direction, but Dino Rex is a completely unique experience. Just look at the game's visuals for a second. All of the animation in the game was done by capturing images of real models due to uncertainty in the industry about whether these novel computer graphics were going to stick around. But the end result is a sort of uncanny and, especially at the time, very unique visual presentation. Much like how Metal Black and Gun Frontier have elaborate stories to contextualize their gameplay, Dino Rex has some elaborate lore, and I think it's best to let it speak for itself. In case you didn't catch that, The world of Dino Rex is ruled by the Amazons and their queen. Once a year, warriors gather to have their dinosaur companions fight to the death for the chance of becoming king. The loser of each match is also killed by a pterodactyl. And if that isn't enough, your character also has prophetic dreams throughout the game where he envisions his dinosaur companion rampaging through a modern city, fighting with the police and the military, and then having a final dramatic showdown with a wealthy real estate developer. I know you might have a question or two, but let me just answer at least one of them. Yes, Dino Rex is a masterpiece of feminist, anti-capitalist art. The uniqueness of Dino Rex extends well beyond its story. Remember that whole bit about how you might expect your character to jump when you pressed up on a joystick? That doesn't happen in Dino Rex. To jump, you need to tap down and then tap up. The game also doesn't have directional jumps, and a full third of the cast don't have any jumping attacks. When you do press up in this game, your dinosaur starts to scream as they build up their power bar, which can then be used to execute this game's version of a super called a combo attack. You get a number of hits based on the number of power bars you have, and it looks really, really cool when you land it. Oh yeah, also blocking is done by holding down instead of holding back. Unless you're Triceratops though, who is too short and unfortunately doesn't get to block. The game also has some surprising depth. In Dino Rex, you can do something similar to car canceling, where you can cancel the early parts of one move into another move. This is especially useful for characters that can cancel the movement from one move into a different attack, thereby extending its range and making it harder to be counterattacked in return. You've also probably noticed at this point that Dino Rex doesn't have any side switching. If things do get messy, the dinos take a break and march back to their respective corners. During testing, the team found that novice players would sometimes die without understanding what was going on, so the temporary truce was added as a way to give players a break, reorient themselves, and maybe even check the game manual or glance down at the arcade cabinet to see what their move list is before picking back up with the action. In the rare, and I do mean very rare, instance that a contest ends in a draw, the warriors themselves step forward to fight it out, and this plays out in an entirely separate fighting game with separate life bars and unique mechanics. The warriors will even do hurricane kicks and other special moves in what Sunba intended as a parody of Street Fighter 2. Now at this point, you might be wondering to yourself, why shouldn't I play Dino Rex? None of that sounds that bad. In fact, some of it even sounds kinda good. Well, I do have bad news. It's one thing to have a unique control scheme to your game, but it's another thing when you have unique controls and they don't function particularly well. Dino Rex started off as a 2-button game, but Taito executives eventually decided that it needed to be a 6-button game a la Street Fighter 2 before ultimately going back to the initial 2-button design. But transitioning the controls and then transitioning them back produced a whole host of bugs, the full extent of which weren't discovered until shortly before the game's release. With a team of mostly junior developers that were already being pulled into different projects and working on concurrent titles, there just wasn't enough time for a full do-over. And so Sunba decided to let it rock, thinking that any imprecision in the game's controls would be covered up by the size of the dinosaurs and that players would understand if things were a little bit cumbersome. Unfortunately, they were not. But does that make Dino Rex a bad game? Should you really not play Dino Rex? Well, I'm just a doctor, pretending to be a deer, pretending to be a horse, pretending to be a decafumo on the internet. And I think you should. If you ever have a chance to sit down and play a round of Dino Rex, it's worth your time. No one sets out to make bad games, and while Dino Rex is unfortunately marked by the constraints of its production, it's still a unique game that could only have been created at a certain junction in history where the conventions of the fighting game genre had begun to crystallize, but hadn't entirely formed yet. It's a unique blend of old and new, with some ideas that have withstood the test of time and others that have, well, gone the way of the dinosaurs. So yeah, if you have a chance, give it a shot. At least give it enough time to get through to one of those bonus stages, because any game that lets you trample over cops to go eat a landlord is worth at least that. it might even be praxis to sit down and give Dino Rex at least a little bit of your time. So, yeah, you heard it here first. Dino Rex is in fact a video game that embodies the spirit of revolutionary politics. You also can't convince me that it doesn't take place in the Universal Century Gundam timeline, so look forward to another video where we try to figure out where exactly Dino Rex fits into that whole mess. But until then, this is what I got. Take care of yourselves, and as always, remember to be nice to yourself. Bye!
Amuro, I'm doing something extremely wicked. If you're nearby, feel my presence.